In this video, I'm going to go over how you can use the Scene Visuals menu to control the look of your scene in SceneForge Studio. The majority of control over scene lighting and visuals happens in the Visuals tab within Stage Mode. We're going to go through the menu from the top down. The first button is the Color Grade button. This opens up the color grading menu that has a variety of options for color adjustments, channel mixing, primary wheels, log wheels, and even being able to import a lookup table file. You can save these presets to files and load them back and forth, allowing you to mix and match between scenes and SceneForge projects. It's important to note that these are options that happen globally on both the entire scene itself as well as the virtual camera. The next option is the Stage Configuration menu. Now this menu will get its own dedicated video in the future, but this is what allows you to control and design your LED wall as the center point of your virtual set. You can choose a stage preset, and of course select what type of content you want on the LED wall, as well as its screen intensity, offset, fit, and of course extension walls. Next is the scene time of day. This is a slider that allows you to specify, well, the time of day in your scene. You can see it influences the global lighting as well as the color of the skybox in the background. If you want to replicate an in-studio environment, of course you turn this all the way down and only rely on rig lighting like you see here. Next we have the sky rotation slider. This allows you to specify the angle of the sun on the y-axis. You can see it adjusts the shadow rotation, and if the sun is lower in the sky, the position of the sun in the background. Next we have tone mapping, which allows you to specify a tone mapping preset for the scene. You can switch between none, neutral, or ACES, or the Academy Color Encoding System. Next we have a section for HDRI Sky, which allows you to specify and import an actual HDR file to use as your skybox. I just imported an HDR file from HDRI Haven, and you can see I can adjust the exposure, as well as the global scene time of day and rotation of the skybox. Right now it's a bit overexposed, but it's as simple as importing the file you want to select. Next, we have the Sky Settings option. When you're not using an HDRI sky, this allows you to specify the density of clouds, as well as the speed of the clouds moving in the sky. You can see these clouds are not volumetric, but they do look highly realistic, with their color adjusting based on time of day and position of the sun. Next, we have Atmospheric Settings. And this allows you to specify the fog density, the distance fall off, as well as the color of the fog. By default, it's automatic based on the time of day. But if you wanted to specify a custom color, you can turn this off and select a color yourself, or use our color picker to select any color you like. Now this is a bit silly, so I'm going to turn the auto fog back on and turn this down. Some light fog can actually increase the photorealism by adding atmosphere to your scene. Note that this is not a true volumetric effect, but rather a lightweight effect that simulates fog in your scene. And finally, we have the post-processing options. This is where you can specify the bloom and ambient occlusion. Bloom essentially simulates light scattering in a camera lens, and that is how you have glowy effects of lights. You can see over here, if I increase the intensity of the light, as I increase the bloom, you can see we have a nice glow on the emitter of that light. Ambient occlusion simulates contact shadows between two surfaces. As I adjust this value, you can see a wider radius of contact shadows between the floor and the LED wall. You can also specify the actual radius distance using this slider over here. It's important to note that these effects are pretty heavy on your GPU, so you may want to use them sparingly depending on the needs of your scene. Some light bloom and ambient occlusion does go a long way in increasing the photorealism of your scene. And that is the Scene Visuals menu. Now let's talk about individual lighting rigs. Under Library and the Lighting tab is where you can bring in different types of lights. These all work the same way, but they're based on different hardware configurations. For example, this light bulb emits light from all directions, as opposed to this spotlight, which emits light only in a single direction. Now, in the properties of the lights, we have a bunch of options. We can turn off whether or not we want the mesh to be visible to virtual cameras, meaning that the stand and the actual light will not show up in virtual cameras. We can turn on and off volumetric VFX, which has this light beam, as you can see here. We can turn off or on shadows, and specify the global illumination mode, which I'll talk about in a moment. Specify the intensity of the light, the spot angle for spotlights, the temperature preset if you want to mimic a real-world bulb, or specify the temperature yourself. Add a tint color if you like, with white being default. And on certain rig types, you can set the rotation of the rig. And finally, you can specify an IES profile or light cookie to further change the effect of the light. Now I'm going to go ahead and remove these other lights to demonstrate the indirect modes of this spotlight. In the real world, a spotlight would have light bouncing behind the light itself, rather than just directly in the line of fire from the light. Now, because SceneForge uses a raster graphics engine and is not physically accurate, it does not have this by default. But we can turn it on a per light basis using one of three modes. None is just off. Multiply GI essentially multiplies the range of the light around the light to simulate the effect of light bouncing around. And finally, we have Ray Trace GI. This is a more accurate, less intense version of the effect that actually traces rays from the light's emitter to try to get an approximation of where light bouncing would be. You can see it's a lot slower, and depending on the position of your light, it may not be super accurate. SceneForge aims to be as photorealistic as possible while working within the constraints of a lightweight 3D rendering application. That's why we have these variety of tricks to improve photorealism without going too high on hardware requirements. By default, I'd recommend leaving them as off unless you need some additional light bouncing around, like so. And finally, on a per object basis, such as this color light checker for example, you can enable ray trace reflections. This is a subtle effect that adds real-time ray trace surface reflections on the object. You can see it's very subtle over here, but we have a reflection between the two bulbs of our color light checker. On some objects, like cars and windows, this may be good to turn on for certain improved photorealism. And that is an overview of lighting and visuals in SceneForge Studio.